Hello and welcome to the Everything is Black and White podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Musgrove, and I'm joined by the BBC Radio Newcastle's Matthew Raisbeck. It is the Monday show. Aaron has another day off. That man is always off doing something else rather than being on this very podcast. But as someone messaged me this morning when I announced that Reza was going to fill in for Aaron, they said it's not a bad substitute to have. So welcome back to the show, Reza. How are you keeping?
Thanks for having me on. What I want to know before we talk about Newcastle, as someone who's never done the Great North Run, how the heck are you? Because you did it yesterday. So I've never had the Monday feeling after the Great North Run. So I want to know how the run was, what your time was, and how you are now, because you seem a bit stiff.
Yes, you just watched me walk up the stairs, and it was not a quick walk up the stairs. People of this podcast who listen to it and watch it regularly will know me now, and I've had a running battle over the past few months building up to yesterday. Yeah. And I just want to point out, ladies and gents, that Aaron is a fair few years younger than me, and I'm also a first-time dad, and I've had barely any sleep in the last year or so, and no training. Aaron has been knocking out 15, 16-kilometre runs every other day, and Mr. Stokes only beat me by 20 seconds.
20 seconds?
20 seconds. 2 hours, 11 minutes. And I suspect Aaron will be the only person on the face of the planet who will be telling his Great North Run time with the seconds included.
Oh, see,
gutted.
Like if he'd beaten you by 20 minutes, then I don't really think you would care today. But 20 seconds.
20 seconds. But like I say, he should have absolutely smashed my time. He didn't. He can brag if he wants. But yeah, but our print editor, who's either turning 50 this year or has just turned 50, 1 hour 56 minutes. So considering he's a good 15 years older than me, and a good probably 20 years older than Aaron, I don't think there's any room to brag.
That's a very fast time. On the positive side for you, when it comes to half marathons, 20 seconds is not a lot to overturn next year.
It's not, and I think compared to last year's time, it was about 20 minutes faster. So I've shaved off a good few minutes. And next year, if my legs hold up, I'll be back and hopefully pushing Aaron and hopefully beating him this time around. But wonderful event, yes. I'm feeling it a little bit. My knees are hurting. And you know what? I've pulled parts of my leg that I didn't even know existed. I don't even know what the bit that connects you, the calf and your hamstrings called. But that went about 8 miles, and I was feeling good at that point. So I had to stretch out. Had to walk for a couple of minutes. That's what's cost us. That's what's cost us, unfortunately. But
on reflection, yes, it is. That is what cost you. The time you spent stretching, you'd have beaten him.
But I think had I not stretched, I probably would have then, collapsed a little bit further on. So it was all damage limitation. But a wonderful day, and it was horrible conditions. Perfect for running, but horrible for spectating. But the streets were lined.
Yeah,
and there's just something very special about the Great North Run. I know a lot of your colleagues did it as well.
Yeah, they did. Quite a few from BBC Radio Newcastle completed it. My friend Simon Pride, who you will probably know from Total Sport, hosts our show every night at 6:00. He's in the same age bracket as your quick colleague that you just mentioned, and I think his was something like 1 hour 35.
Yeah,
he's very fast, but he has been a marathon runner in earlier years of his life, so he's kind of got a lot behind him, but that's still incredibly quick.
I heard him on today's breakfast show, the Matt Bailey breakfast show. Matt also did it. I beat Matt, which I was very happy with. But Pride, he was saying he was a little bit good at that actually in many ways, because he was wanting to get under a certain time, but he'd only had a knee operation last year. Yeah. So you got to take the bad with a good. Fantastic time. But yeah, wonderful events. I was running for the Sir Boy Robson Foundation, which is, a brilliant charity in the name of one of the Newcastle United's legends, raising important funds. And I know so many great charities, though. It's just great to see so many funds being raised for such important causes. So anyone that ran it, I hope you guys are feeling okay. Anyone who's donated to whatever cause, that's a fantastic gesture. And hopefully we'll see you guys out on the streets next year. Will you be running?
No, I've never done it, and I've never wanted to do it. I've worked on Great North Run Day on the radio many times, sometimes in the studio, and quite a few years at the finish line. I always felt a bit weird being at the finish line, having not run it, or not being there as a volunteer, helping people out afterwards. But it's a great event, and I love the TV coverage. But for some reason, I've just never wanted to do it. I've dropped people off at the start line before. So I've kind of, sort of been around it a lot, but I've never done it. I'm sure I will do it.
You've got to do it at least once.
At some point. Yeah, at some point. But I don't really enjoy like long distance running. So I don't want to deny someone a place. And I'm happy being a sponsor of other people, which I am every year. But if I do sign up, then we can compare times.
I'll run with you and I'll keep you company.
That'd be nice.
Yeah, wonderful afternoon. Congratulations to everyone who did compete. We've got a lot to talk about. I know it's international break, but there's plenty going on. We ran a survey on Chronicle Live last week, which ran for a few days. More than 2,000 people took part in it, and it was all based around questions on the transfer market. And some of the results are quite interesting. I'm going to read you out the results. Thank you if you took part. And then we're going to get Matthew's take on these results and plenty more to come as well. We've had loads of questions sent in. You can do so via the EIBW podcast at reachplc.com. If you're watching live on YouTube, get into the comments. We've had loads over on Twitter or X as well. If you are watching live, hit thumbs up and give it a share on YouTube. Thank you as always. We'll just dive straight into the questions because I know we can talk about Paul Mitchell's interview and what have you after this, but I want to start with these questions.
I love the surveys that you do, genuinely. I have filled them in years gone by. I know not this one, but I always find it fascinating. Obviously, the questions are targeted and focused as well. So it is a good way of measuring how a lot of supporters feel. And maybe it confirms kind of what we already know, but it is interesting to see the breakdown of results as well with the options that you give. So when you told me we were doing this, I've been quite excited to see because in typical Newcastle style, nothing's exactly straightforward.
No,
is it? Unbeaten, and yet
it still feels like something bubbling away under the surface. Yeah, something negative, doesn't there?
Things are not necessarily as settled as we'd like them to be.
Yeah, well, we'll dive in with the first question, and it was, how happy are you with the club's ownership? And the options were very happy, happy, content, unhappy, or very unhappy. And the one with the majority of the vote on 33% was happy. You had 29% on very happy, 26% on content, and 9% with unhappy, 3% with very unhappy. I think, content, happy, I don't think there's too much difference there in that kind of definition. What do you make of those results? I guess, obviously, this has been asked after the transfer window, which was very underwhelming. It's come just a couple of days after the window closed. Yeah, people aren't going to be overly pleased at what happened. So I think, medium, middle ground is what you would come to expect with the happiness of the club's ownership.
Yeah, you got is it 12% who are either unhappy or very unhappy, which is very small, and you've got quite a large sample size there as well. If you'd asked that question a year ago, then I think it would have been in single digits, wouldn't it? Because of the fact they were in the Champions League, and even though they had a bad start last year, they'd made some exciting signings last summer. So it reflects the time that we're in right now. And I take your point about the transfer window, because I think that has really, the mood has turned, hasn't it, from where it would have been even at the end of last season, even with Manchester United winning the FA Cup, which was a blow because it meant no Europe. Still think there was a lot of optimism and hope about what could lie ahead. The Newcastle United supporters understand the world that the club is in with PSR. They understand the issues last season with an injury crisis, with Europe and the demands that brought. They get the bigger picture. Everyone is well versed in it. But it is interesting. And I think, timing as a response to the transfer window, that those figures there, but also you've got nearly 90% of people who you would say are happy to some degree with the ownership, and the criticism has not really been of the ownership. It's been more of the executive team, people who run the club and are there to get transfer deals done. And there's been some criticism as well on X of Eddie Howe in all of that, and wondering what his role is. So I think probably the happiness, the satisfaction with the owners is understandable. It would have been a bit higher in the past, but as we go through this, we'll find out a bit more about how people feel on transfers specifically.
Yeah, I mean, 29% very happy, which is perhaps no surprise. If you remember where Newcastle United have come from to where they are, if we were having this conversation about Newcastle United not signing, one or two players to make sure that they can properly go and attack the top four this season, we having that conversation 4 or 5 years ago, we would have stopped. We would have taken it, and we would have laughed whoever began that conversation out of the room. So it shows you how far they have come, but they've got to keep going, haven't they?
Yeah, well, you strengthen from like a position of strength, really, which they tried to do a year ago, and then for various reasons, the signings that they made didn't quite have the impact. Although we can see that they're all very good players, and hopefully this year they all will. But yeah, this summer it's a missed opportunity in a massive way. And look, we can all appreciate why Eddie Howe has said you don't want to make a mistake. You can't make the wrong signing, and Newcastle can't afford to get anything wrong in the transfer market, because we all understand how the financial rules are hurting a club like Newcastle. But it is frustrating when they don't pursue other options, because there must be other options, other players that can improve the team and improve the squad, but I think particularly improve the starting 11. And there are players who moved to other clubs this summer that Newcastle, I think if they'd been in for and been able to get, they would be stronger for that. And you had almost 2 months, from July, from Paul Mitchell coming in to get some significant business done, and they didn't. And it feels like a waste of a transfer window, and one that puts more pressure on. And that's my concern for January and then for next summer, because they will have more to do, because the issues they didn't address in the summer will almost certainly still be apparent in January. It's a tough window, we know. And then next summer, what do you do? Because there tends to be more player movement. There will be contracts coming to an end, and things like that. So I think they're leaving themselves with a lot more work to do. I completely understand both sides, but it's nothing other than a disappointment, unfortunately. And I think it's the first time that they've been, as a team of people running the club, being questioned properly over the decisions they've taken, because I don't think they'd gotten much wrong at all. Very, very little wrong. And so much was right in previous windows. And this is the first time that I think there's actually been some anger directed towards the club.
Yeah, and it was interesting that Paul Mitchell came out and spoke to the media. We think it was always sort of planned, maybe, the date and time, what have you, but he always did plan to come out and speak to the media, and he wants to have that kind of open door policy in a relationship where he can do that. But it'd be so intriguing to know what the very top brass have made of what he said, because he talked about things not being fit for purpose. He talked about things having to change, and he talked about having this more supportive role in the transfer market since he came in. But, was he brought in and the instant expectation on him was that, it's now on you? Or was he brought in with the knowledge that he does have this window as a kind of learning curve, and, you're not expected to do too much? Because I think that answer is really crucial, because we've seen potential stories over the weekend about rumors of a potential exit and whatever. I mean, that's not going to happen. But I think we need to know where the mind of actually the top brass are when it comes to what they expect from Mitchell in that first 6 weeks or so.
We don't hear a lot from PIF, do we? And maybe if they had said something over the international break, that would have given us more information and more clarity on how the club sees things in terms of the window, where they are now, and what comes next. But they've brought people into these executive roles in order to run the club and do the job. And when Paul Mitchell was appointed, I think there was a reaction of, wow, Newcastle have got somebody who is a big name, who's been mentioned around other big jobs in football. He's held some really top positions. He's got a background in recruitment as well. And all of that's really key. But it clearly hasn't been an easy start for him. And it's been a really just a a horrible transfer window in many respects, with the frantic end to June and the sales they had to make, and the sales that they thankfully avoided making. So it's a window I think we all want to move on from and get away from. But like I say, my concern is the impact that the events of the summer have on the next few windows. So, and I think Paul Mitchell's under a lot of pressure and a lot of scrutiny now because of the way the summer went. His comments last week were really interesting, and there were a lot of them. Now, he was talking to the written media from the Northeast at St James's Park, but broadcasters weren't invited, so we weren't there. BBC Radio Newcastle, nothing was filmed or on tape. So I always think when we see quotes from people, it can be difficult sometimes to understand the tone in which it was said and just how it was delivered. And sometimes things look worse written down than they do when you're hearing them or seeing them. Therefore, I think, obviously, I would say this, a broadcast interview would have been beneficial, but I think it's good that someone came out to speak so quickly after the window. International break's the ideal time to do it. But yeah, there are some comments in there that probably give you more questions than answers as well. A suggestion that the transfer policy hadn't been fit for purpose. Now, I don't know if that was a direct quote or if he was responding to that being put to him. A lot of things that he said about Eddie Howe, and also he was understandably asked about the England situation, and he said Newcastle love Eddie Howe, but he didn't rule out Eddie Howe leaving. But he's a new person at Newcastle United, and we need to get to know these people. And that was always a problem in the past, that you would only ever hear from a manager. So it is good to hear from other voices, even if a lot of supporters looking at the reaction are not entirely convinced by everything that's been said.
Well, we've got a few questions sent in, and I'll ask you one of them now. We had one sent in from Ian, who asks, do you think the club may regret sanctioning Paul Mitchell's interview, given some of what was written and the reaction since?
No, I don't think they will, because from their point of view, trying not to speak for the club, they need to be proactive and getting people out to talk to supporters through the media. Darren Eales has done a lot of that. Peter Silverstone, the chief commercial officer, has been doing that a lot recently with the kit launch and with St James's Stack and things like that. And Paul Mitchell, as sporting director, should be addressing the media. It shouldn't all just be on the manager or Eddie Howe or Steve Bruce before him or Rafa Benitez before him, and go back, as far as you like, really, to the mid-2000s, because that was always the case. So I don't think they will. And look, there's a lot of value in what he said, and I think we all needed to hear some explanations and learn a bit more. I just think some of what he said maybe just had you, wondering and questioning exactly what went on, and then what comes next at Newcastle. And I've seen there've been some reports subsequent to his interview last week about the situation at Newcastle. Like I said before, it just seems as though things are not as settled as we probably all want them to be.
Which is maybe a tad expected, given the big changes in the boardroom during the summer. But we talk about the mixed reaction. We've got a comment here from Darren, who says, have to love this Mitchell fallout. A man with his CV and experience shouldn't be pointing the finger and should have hit the ground running after 2 weeks. No more excuses, Mitchell. And that's obviously Darren's opinion, but that is an opinion which I do think is shared by quite a bit of the fan base who've looked at this interview and gone, that doesn't read like everyone's singing off the same hymn sheet.
From his point of view, Paul Mitchell will have had messages he wanted to get out there, because he was getting a lot of criticism on social media and on our Total Sport phone-in on the radio. And I noticed that he said that he had a supporting role in the transfer window. And now you would imagine that would change by the time January comes. He's had time to actually settle into his job at the club. I think the key thing for me is always this. And, if you are able to remember back to previous eras at Newcastle, Kevin Keegan, second time around, even Chris Hughton, Alan Pardew, and wondering exactly who signed the players, who made the decisions Rafa Benitez as well, and the process of getting transfers done. Yeah, it's very important that the manager has the final say. And Eddie Howe, when he was pressed on this over the summer by the media, had said that he will say yes or no to players put to him, and obviously he has some input. That from my analysis would be it's really important that remains, that the manager always has the final say, because he has to integrate players into the team and get them to perform. But it's everything that leads you to pursuing a target that he'll be looking at and may need to change. And I guess that's why the comment about fit for purpose is so interesting, because you look at the way other clubs recruit, and clubs that aren't as big and as powerful as Newcastle, whether it's Brighton, who are probably the best example, the way that they sign players, where they sign them from, and how they sell them, something Newcastle haven't been very good at. So in addition to signing established names, if there can be more of that, if that's a change that can be implemented, then I think as fans, as observers, we'll be delighted, because that's the way we want to see the club run, and that helps it become sustainable and helps you avoid a situation like we saw at the end of June. So there's certainly things that I think they can improve on and that they can need to change as well. They also still have the head of recruitment, Steve Nixon, who's been there a long time and has been responsible for a lot of successes in the transfer market. And he's someone that you hear very little of. He's in the background, but he's well regarded, well respected, and he's held that position through different ownerships as well. So he will be an important figure at Newcastle too. I think the way that they do things, look, we know pre-takeover it wasn't the way that other Premier League clubs operated. Since the takeover, it's been difficult. It's not even 3 years. We've got somebody in now who has got this background in recruitment, who's delivered it in top jobs. So he does need to be given time to see what he can do. But yeah, the summer will be looked back on, I think, with a lot of disappointment and regret.
And he said in that interview, every player we spoke about or targeted, Eddie Howe was wanting to explore that player. So Eddie Howe was involved in the list. He's also went on record to say as well that there has to be change, maybe targeting players from Europe who maybe you've not heard of, not just targeting these established English players which come with that English tax, which is already on top of the Newcastle United tax. And of course, Steve Nixon's the really interesting one, because he said that it's not fit for purpose, but again, we don't know how things work exactly within the club. But if you say something's not fit for purpose and your head of recruitment is still there, who's been there for many, many years, as you say, he's not going to be happy hearing that. So what do you think the future for Steve Nixon is?
Well, that could be as much about selling players at the right time, because that's something Newcastle haven't done. They didn't do it in the Ashley era, and they haven't really done it in the new era. Although, Chris Wood, John Joe Shelby, maybe Alan San-Maximin as well, they got money for, and in a couple of cases, good money. But there might have been opportunities last season that they didn't take. And look, they have spent a lot of money since the January transfer window in 2022. They have, we know that, but they did that and spend a lot of money to stay up and then try and catch up. And then they're so far ahead of schedule. They've obviously, tried to build on that, but it's led them to this point. And I think we probably thought that because they weren't active in January this year, they took the decision not to do anything. There wasn't a lot around. And obviously Calvin Phillips went to West Ham, could have been in a Newcastle shirt. They didn't go for it. And that was probably a good decision in the end, because he had a tough time at West Ham. And we saw that at St. James's Park, didn't we, in that thrilling comeback in March. But I think a lot of it could just be about selling at the right time as well, in terms of a policy, getting players out to then get players in. But I think because they didn't do anything in January, the expectation would have been that the summer might have been more transformative than it actually was. And
I guess you've got the problem, though, that if they haven't done anything in January and they haven't done anything in this summer, then the expectation is going to be January coming.
This is why I say my concern is about the pressure that's going to be on them in January. And if they don't have things lined up ready to go at the start of January, because you don't want another frantic end to a window. I mean, the end of last month with the Gahey thing, will it happen? Won't it happen? Anthony Elanga on deadline day, obviously a play that they looked at previously and couldn't get on either occasion in the summer. I hope that they're not in a position where they're doing that. But if there aren't things ready early in January, I think there will be more criticism, and I think the tensions will rise. And the scars of the Mike Ashley era when it comes to transfer windows are still there for supporters. Big issues not being addressed. Less now in this era when it comes to selling top players, but there's real disappointment and sadness, although a degree of understanding with Elliot Anderson and Yankuba Minte. But I don't think it takes much for Newcastle supporters to be a bit triggered and to be reminded of what it used to be like and how transfer windows were always an ordeal. And it hadn't been that way since the takeover, but this summer to a large extent was. And there are factors that are beyond Newcastle United in that the market was really slow to begin with. There's PSR that they're having to comply with, but you know, those are not self-imposed constraints. Those are financial rules that Newcastle have to operate within. Otherwise, as we saw last season, big punishments could come. But I think after not doing anything in January, you know, it wasn't unreasonable or unrealistic to expect that they would have done something big, at least one big thing in the summer gone.
And I think people you speak to around Newcastle expect that with a few months at Newcastle United, Paul Mitchell will deliver. You know, there's confidence with what he can do. There's confidence with the recruitment team. And the more they get to know each other, the more they get to work with one another. And, you know, people might look upon what he said negatively, but you read what he said about Eddie Howe, and he clearly wants a working relationship. He clearly wants it to work. Yes, there might be a bit of tension, but, you know, that always happens when someone new comes in and has a bit more of an influence than maybe used to. That's going to happen when you've lost two people like Amanda and Mirdad from the club. That's going to happen. So there's plenty of elements which have probably made this a trickier start than anybody would have liked. But there is confidence from certain sections that, you know, January and next summer you will see the full force of what Mitchell can do in a role where he's got a big influence in buying players.
Well, I think he said last week to the written media in the Northeast that he'll know in, did he say 5 years?
He said 5 years.
That if he's done a good job. So that's a longer term or medium to longer term plan and vision. And in football, we all want things now, and there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. But yeah, it is going to take time. And I think we can accept that. We can understand that. He's been brought in because he has a track record that's among the best in the game, and he has a background in recruitment. So, you know, we need to see what he can do. He needs to be given time. And of course, that key relationship with Eddie Howe, the manager, and, you know, the supporters, the overwhelming majority, I think, back Eddie Howe and are behind him because of the wonderful work that he's done over nearly 3 years at Newcastle. So that relationship has to be right. But I think it's also important that your point about it being a summer of change at Newcastle with Amanda Staveley, Mehrdad Guddusi going, big changes behind the scenes to the ownership structure, to the running of the club, because they had played such a central role. And without them, as we know, there would have been no takeover. So new relationships have to be formed. There's also the new head of performance, James Bunce, who came in this summer. You know, the club is evolving and is changing, but I think Paul Mitchell said that, didn't he? Eddie Howe knows that Newcastle United needs to evolve, and that is part of their growth.
You were in Germany when Eddie Howe had the interview, and it was a little bit different for you because he'd done it for the written press first, and he caught. Was it yours before or after?
Yeah, I was at Adidas in July, and Eddie Howe did 4 or 5 separate interviews. He did the written media together, so everything that you'd have read in the newspapers, Chronicle, but also national newspaper titles, was taken from the written media session
before
he came to speak to me, and then he spoke to Sky Sports and then the club website after that, in that order. So the broadcast interviews were separate. They were one-on-ones. The written media were all just like us, but more of them around a table. Eddie Howe was there, and that was a session that lasted maybe 20, 25 minutes. And, you know, everyone asked a couple of questions, and it was probably a little bit fraught at times. It was the first time that we'd heard from him in the summer. There was the England speculation because Gareth Southgate had gone that week. and then there had been the changes behind the scenes. And yeah, I hadn't really heard him talk like that before. And he was very clear that he loves Newcastle and he wants to stay, but he talked about wanting to be happy and feel supported. And yeah, a couple of months on, yeah, I wonder how he feels in that
Well,
respect.
so that was what I was going to ask you, because you would have been one of the last people to speak to him before this international break. Obviously, came on the back of that win against Tottenham, which was fantastic. But do you sense a change in his attitude, a change in his feeling? I think he has answered questions on it. Paul Mitchell obviously was asked about the relationship as well. But from your feeling when you speak to him, from what you felt back in Germany to what you felt a week ago, how do you think he's feeling about the whole Paul Mitchell setup?
Well, I think he'll be enjoying having more time on the training pitch this season compared to last year with the European matches, although at this stage last year they hadn't yet played in the Champions League, but you know what I mean. They will have that. And Paul Mitchell actually said it, didn't he, that how impressive Eddie Howe is on the training pitch. But I think we all know that because the players say that. Even players that aren't being picked will tell you how good a coach he is, great a coach he is, and also a manager. So I think that will really help the team, and it can still be a great season because they've got a fantastic team. They have got a good squad when everyone's fit. Keeping them fit is key, and if they can strengthen in January, then who knows where it can take them. So all is not lost because they didn't add a couple of quality players to improve the starting 11. But these relationships sometimes need to take time, and it's clearly been tested over the summer because of, you've got a new sporting director coming in during a transfer window. That's probably not ideal because they're straight in and there are things to be done. And they didn't do much. It was William Osula and then some departures at the end of the window, really, in terms of deals that were completed. It just takes time. And we need to see how they can work together, and also the new head of performance as well, and what impact that has on player availability and also the way that Newcastle approach things this season in terms of their training and on a match day as well. So there are new relationships that need to be formed and developed.
I just want to get your opinion on something else that Paul Mitchell said about communication with Eddie Howe. Now, you guys have hopefully watched and you've listened to the podcast with Simon Burr, which came out last week. He was one of the journalists in the room with Paul Mitchell. He asked him various questions and we went into depth about his feelings and his ability to apply some context to what was said. But I want to get Razor's view on this. He talked about ringing him or WhatsApping him, but you were in the interview prior to that where Eddie Howe said, "I'm a little bit back from transfer negotiations. I'm a little bit out of the loop." I'm paraphrasing there, but what do you think he would have made of what Paul Mitchell said? Now, is it a case that Eddie Howe sometimes likes to, how should we say, he knows what he's doing and maybe he says certain things to get a certain message out? And because I'm just wondering about his reaction to that, because whichever way you look at it, it doesn't look good. And it's something so tiny, but actually it could have a massive impact because, again, it doesn't look brilliant.
Well, the way I interpreted Eddie Howe's comments on this were more that he wasn't necessarily involved in the deals, in terms of getting a running commentary on negotiations and every discussion, every twist and turn in the Mark Gay he pursued, for example. Yeah, I suppose they are to an extent contradictory statements. Eddie Howe not being a bit out the loop, and then Paul Mitchell saying that they will communicate every night. Of course, they have to communicate probably daily. Yeah, so I take that point. It might well be something that Eddie Howe is pressed on when he meets the media again on Friday morning for his irregular news conference ahead of a match. He has to do that before every Premier League game. It's on a Friday morning ahead of a weekend fixture. So I'm sure that's going to come up and just to try and get some more clarity. But I think the way that Eddie Howe's handled it, there was one press conference, and it might have been before the Bournemouth match, where I thought he seemed a bit tense, almost a bit edgy, actually, which you don't normally get. But in the last week of the window, I thought he was really measured in the way that we're used to seeing him, and was really dealt with questions on transfers and understood the fan frustration and the way that tensions were rising really well, and was really controlled when other managers may have gone for a different option. So I thought he handled it well and was able to calm things down a little bit. But yeah, I think he could be pushed on that on Friday.
I think he's handled it very well, in fact. And again, we go back to how you can look at this from a positive aspect. There definitely is a want from Paul Mitchell, and I think Eddie Howe as well, to have this relationship working, because if it does, it's fantastic for Newcastle United. And Les in the commentator says surely Eddie was only talking about negotiations as opposed to transfers in general, and Paul Mitchell was pressed on it, and he said he felt that was more of a historical gripe from Eddie Howe rather than one in the present. But it'll be interesting to see if Howe is indeed asked about that on Friday. I mean, just in general, your kind of overarching view on the interview with Mitchell, reason to be positive?
No, I just think it was from a club point of view, I would say that they did the right thing getting someone to speak within a few days of the transfer window closing. The international break gave them the opportunity to do that. And for years we were frustrated at a lack of communication from boardroom level at Newcastle United. Now, that was often because there was only one person. There was only one director previously, Lee Charnley, who was in a very difficult situation, but took plenty of flack from supporters over a number of years. Fans who, as we know, hated the way the club was being run. Now it's different. We get other voices. We hear from other people. I think that's important, and that needs to continue, because it can't always be the manager. And there are some things that he just can't answer. And they have this new structure now. There was no sporting director pre-takeover. So this is still relatively new to us in the way that Newcastle United work. And now they've got a different sporting director. So things are going to take a bit of time. We need to get to know these people. We need to hear from them. And I think that can just engender goodwill towards them. So it's good that he's come out to speak. Yet there are some things that we need to maybe, reflect on and perhaps follow up on in terms of what he said. And maybe there'll be more questions for Eddie Howe on that. But it's just so crucial that relationship works, but also that there's a demonstration of Paul Mitchell's abilities as a sporting director for fans to feel reassured that Newcastle United will be successful in the transfer market, and then that success can then be translated onto the pitch as well by making good signings and also selling players and bringing money in, so that they're not in the situation they were at the end of June. And I'm sure that is right at the top of his agenda.
I think with what he said, and a lot of people actually respond by saying, fantastic, but it's all about action. He set himself up for January, for the summer. I think he's maybe even raised expectations in many ways with his talk of change and what's to come. If he hits every mark, it's going to be fantastic. But as we've already spoken about, there is that expectation and there is now pressure, but we will wait and see what happens in the coming months. And we'll dive back into the questions that you guys answered. Where will Newcastle United finish this season? Top 4, 6%, 5th to 6th, 44%, 7th to 8th, 31%, top half, 17%, and outside of the top half, 2%. And I'm going to give you the percentages to the next question as well, because I think they kind of go hand in hand. The biggest concern over the next couple of months, i.e. up to January, strength of the starting 11, 21%, squad depth, 57%, Howe leaving, 22%. And for me, it's the middle one there, squad depth. That is the big concern, because if that fails them, which I have a fear it may do, then that kind of goes into the percentages about where they'll finish. Add 2 players, I think you see quite easily 20-25% people saying top 4 is more of a possibility. But because they haven't managed to add those players, because you've got injuries to Botman, to Lascelles, to Callum Wilson, the expectation has been lowered slightly. And I actually think maybe 5th or 6th for some might be too wishful thinking, because I just think the squad is 1 or 2 injuries away from a bit of a chaotic time of it. It's a fantastic squad. Everyone's fit, but there are a lot of players who are missing. There's players who are injury prone. And even that aside, right now, there aren't that many options. And I'm namely thinking about maybe Alexander Isak up top. If he, heaven forbid, picks up an injury this week on national duty, who do Newcastle United turn to? If he's just out of form, who do Newcastle United turn to? So I can understand where that 57% are coming from, and when it comes to worries about squad depth.
What did you predict before the season
Well,
started?
I predicted fourth,
Yeah.
but that was on the condition they bought a right winger and a centre back. I still think they've got a chance, but it's just everyone has to stay fit, and even if you get that, everyone has to be on form. And look, you're never going to get a player who has 38 games where they are feeling it every single week. It's just not going to happen.
This summer, before the window closed, I said third because
Third?
I said third
Okay.
because no Europe, more time on the training pitch, Tonali coming back, Harvey Barnes having had a pre-season, and I think we've seen already this season that he has started well. Other young players like Lewis Hall, Tino Livramento have had a year with Newcastle. They'll be better for that. There's lots of reasons, and I thought they can make a big step forwards, but it also was contingent, like yours, on a couple of players coming in to strengthen the first 11. Now, the link you've made between those two questions, I think, is right because, well, they are intrinsically linked, aren't they? Because if there is an issue with injuries in the squad, it's going to affect their finishing position. My view would be it's that the squad is actually deeper than it was last season. At the minute, there's no injury crisis, and let's hope that doesn't happen. It didn't really take hold properly until perhaps the end of October, I would say, but it lasted several months last season. I think they've got better options now. When you look at the bench now, right wing, left wing is still an issue, and we've touched on this in what it might mean for January, because at the minute it would have to be Gordon or Barnes on the opposite side to where they want to play to get both of them in, because they should be starting. But then you still have Almiron and Murphy on the bench. When Callum Wilson comes back, you hope that he'll be fit at the same time as Alexander Isak, which hasn't happened enough over the last 2 years. But William Osula, we've only seen him for 60 minutes or so in a friendly, but I liked what I saw. At least they have a young striker there, which is something that they haven't had, someone who will be third choice, but will hopefully get opportunities. Lloyd Kelly's going to play more and already has, in terms of having a big role in the Premier League, than Paul Dummett, who left at the end of his contract earlier this summer. I think they have beefed up the squad. For me, it's the starting 11 that needed to really be enhanced with a couple of targeted signings. But Tonali coming back is absolutely massive. New signings give everybody a lift. Fans, players, I'm sure it helps raise the standards. You need to evolve your team. I think they've improved the squad, but I think they need to enhance the options for the starting 11. But I also say I think they've improved the squad. There's two players that would have figured and that would feature that they had to sell at the end of June, unfortunately, because Yankuba Minte, as a left-footed player coming in off the right, as he's done for Brighton, would have been involved. Elliot Anderson, undoubtedly, who can play in multiple positions, would have been involved. But I think what they did in terms of who they brought in, fine, and I think the squad looks better because everyone's fit. But for me, it's the starting 11. So my prediction of third, I might revise that. It's just difficult, isn't it? Because they're unbeaten, but also the performances haven't been as good as we were probably expecting.
Yeah, they've not been great. And as Les points out in the comments, Isak has played his 2 games, but I'm not sure if that means he necessarily comes home straight away from the camp. He's scored 3 goals.
He has scored 3 goals.
Admittedly, not against very tough opposition. I've got them written down. I think one was Estonia.
Yes.
And the other one was Azerbaijan. So, not world-beaten teams, but hey, international goals, and he's looked absolutely brilliant. And when it comes to, the transfer market, and the next question actually is, how happy are you with the summer window? You've got very happy 1%, happy 2%, content 16%, unhappy 42%, and very unhappy 39%. But I do feel like that was maybe answered when it comes to the mindset of incomings.
Mm-hmm.
But when you think about who they've held on to, Bruno, release clause, still here. Alexander Isak still here, Anthony Gordon's still here. Those three are so important to what Newcastle United hopefully are going to achieve in the years to come. Holding on to those three, plus Joe Linton, I know he'd signed a deal anyway, so he wasn't going to go anywhere, but holding on to your best players in a very volatile market is actually sometimes the best bit of business you can do.
Yeah, these conversations that we're having now would be very different if they'd had to sell Bruno, Isak or Gordon at the end of June, or they'd chosen to sell them at another point in the summer because an offer was so good. And that money would have had to have been reinvested. But the thought of any one of those three players not being at Newcastle now is quite alarming, really. So absolutely right and good that they avoided that. Thankfully, they avoided that. But it meant that two young players that could have been a big part in the future of Newcastle, and I think they're going to have great careers because they're both very talented. Yankuba Minte and Elliot Anderson had to go, and it's just such a shame that Newcastle United, with wealthy owners who support the club and want the club to become successful sustainably, as they keep telling us, have to sell an academy graduate and a talented young player that, they had high hopes for, just to comply and be within a limit on what is, effectively a soft deadline in the middle of the summer. But if it's that, or the other option is losing one of your big names, then obviously they made a difficult decision, a hard decision, but the right one. I know there will be, you watching this, listening to this might be concerned about what happens next summer or in January if this season doesn't go well. And there's no European football, no Champions League next season. Would those three players still want to be at Newcastle United? And if they're not seeing the club show ambition by bringing in other quality players at their level or better, if possible, then how are they going to feel? And I think that's a legitimate argument and a legitimate concern. But I suppose you have to give the club the benefit of the doubt and then get to January and get to next summer and see where they are. But yeah, I mean, as weird as the end of June was, and as difficult and awful as the summer was, I think generally in terms of transfers and the fallout of it here at Newcastle, it would have been a million times worse if any one of those three had gone.
It would have been. But do you think, given some of the quotes from Paul Mitchell about having to be better traders, has he, in many ways, as Darren Neils did a few months back, maybe opened up the door to say at some point you're going to have to lose one of your very best players, like Liverpool sold Coutinho to Barcelona, to bring in that money, and then you will see that money reinvested. And believe me, I do not want this to be the case, but if in the summer, maybe January after, Real Madrid come knocking with a bid of 200-odd million pounds for Alexander Isak, which you laugh, but it's not an unrealistic price tag given just how good he is. That's hard money to turn down. As long as that's reinvested into the team, that's the kind of trading that Newcastle are going to have to do.
Sure. And I think those three, when he gets fit again, chuck Sven Botman in that bracket, because he was in that bracket before the injury last season, and he had a really tough season. We must remember him because he is, when he's fit, he is sublime. What a player. They're probably not going to spend the rest of their careers at Newcastle United. It would be wonderful if they did. But that's probably not going to be the case. So you have to sell at the optimum time, don't you, to get the most money. And I think that's more of a general point that the club have made about selling at the right time, being good sellers. I used the example of Brighton earlier. Look at what they've done with Ben White, Mark Cucurella. I mean, even Dan Burn, to Newcastle. Not that much, but they got good money for someone who's then gone and done brilliantly here. So everyone's benefited from that deal. Alexis McAllister as well. It maybe didn't go for as much. I think there was a release clause that was quite low that Liverpool paid Brighton, but you get the point. Robert Sanchez, the goalkeeper that went to Chelsea, like, they have sold brilliantly, and probably their fans know that their big players will move on, but they trust the club to bring in somebody else who will do just as well, if not better, and that cycle continues. And that's where, you know, Newcastle United are bigger than Brighton, but you can learn from that approach, and that's the kind of thing that I hope that they can implement over the next few years. That selling players, and it doesn't have to be. I used the example of Dan Burn. He wouldn't have been one of Brighton's big names, but they sold him for decent money, and they've obviously got other players that have come in and played and done very well since he departed. Newcastle's problem, and it's been a problem over a longer period, has been probably holding on to players after their value has dropped. This was definitely a thing towards the end of the Mike Ashley era when I can't remember which summer it was, but I think Federico Fernandez got a new contract. You obviously had Kieran Clark, Dwight Gale, players that had been in the Championship season were still there, and Newcastle renewed contracts. They kept these players on, and then when the takeover happened, it was difficult for Newcastle to like refresh the squad because they still had so many players under contract that weren't going to feature, and that's been a problem again this summer. Isaac Hayden, who is respected and liked by the Newcastle fans, still got 2 years on his contract, but he's not part of the first team squad. Ryan Fraser left for Southampton on deadline day, but he would have had another 12 months. Jamal Lewis has got to move as well, but you know, he'd been out on loan for a couple of years, and having these players under contract when they're not going to feature is not just a new issue at Newcastle. It was their pre-takeover, but it's something that they haven't dealt with well historically. So hopefully they will, and it might mean that there are some surprises. It might mean there's some sadness when players go, but they've got to look at the business side of it and the financial deal in order to help them never go back to what they went through in June.
Yeah, some tough decisions maybe to come over the next couple of windows. Gary says, I'll be honest, in the current situation in football, Isak is irreplaceable. Strikers or goal scorers are in serious short supply. I'd rather lose Bruno than Isak, and that's saying something. That's been backed up there by Les in the comments. You mentioned there before about the kind of priority. You know, one of the questions was which position did Newcastle need to strengthen most? Defence 57%, attack 36%, you had midfield 6%, and goalkeeper 1%. So obviously people wanted to see a defender brought in. Newcastle wanted to go after Mark Gay. Now, Mitchell didn't name him specifically, but said, you know, we're not going to overpay. And the other question in this survey was, should Newcastle have paid for Mark Gay or walked away sooner? 10% said paid the value. 90% said walked away and found an alternative sooner, which they walked away, but they didn't find that alternative. Do you think they should have walked away before they did? Now, again, there's various stories, isn't there? You know, how many bids were put in? When was the last bid put in? You know, no one will really know other than the club secretaries, probably, even though they've got it in the hand. But you know, should Newcastle United have turned to an alternative? I mean, we go back to what Eddie Howe said. You know, we kind of not just buying a player for buying sake, because we need to fill that position. It has to be someone who improves the team. But you know, Mark Gay was not the only centre back out there that could improve that defence.
Yes, although I'm a huge fan of Fabian Schär, and look, obviously he's maybe not going to be there longer term, like someone of the age of Mark Gahey in their early to mid 20s could, you know, theoretically be. But I'm very happy with Fabian Schär playing at centre back, whether it's alongside Dan Burn or maybe Lloyd Kelly, Sven Botman when he comes back. And look, there will be plenty of supporters who feel that that's not going to lift Newcastle to the next level, and I understand that. But to be better than Fabian Schär, you're going to have to be extremely good. Now, Mark Gahey could play alongside Fabian Schär, but then when Sven Botman comes back, you would have a problem. But then the top teams will all have elite level centre backs that they will pick from, and a group that they will, you know, have competing with each other, and that's how you get into those top positions, because you have the quality options for your first 11, and then you have a stronger squad because of it. I was never too worried about centre back. For me, it was more the right side of the attack. Now, I know Anthony Gordon can play there. They could switch Harvey Barnes over maybe for a part of a game, but they both want to start on the left. Miguel Almiron he hasn't scored for Newcastle since December. He's been in and out of the team. Jacob Murphy had a phenomenal pre-season and then set up the winning goal, did brilliantly for that against Tottenham. They add value to the team and to the squad, but I don't think they necessarily do it on the consistent basis that Gordon did it. Well, not many did last season, and that a fully fit Harvey Barnes, after a full pre-season behind him, would be able to do as well. So I feel like somebody of their level right now for the right-hand side would have been my preference for the summer over and above any other position.
Well, next subject is about a man who plays out on the wing. I'll just dive into some comments first. Baz says, if we fail, Gordon is a standout to sell to Liverpool. Gary says, the club are looking for centre-backs, a player from the back who can spray passes and are comfortable with the ball at the feet. Be good to have Share back. We should be back on Sunday against Wolves after serving that 3-game suspension. Now, Anthony Elanga was the one they targeted. And I think the first thing to say is that what happened on deadline day just did not feel very Newcastle United under this ownership. It felt like the ownership of old. What we've seen in previous windows under this ownership was they're very planned and meticulous, and there's no panic, there's no reactionary kind of bidding. Whereas the £50 million that was rumoured to be put down for Elanga, it did seem a bit of a panicked move.
Well, it's a player that they like, so I don't think it's entirely a last minute thing. But in terms of a late move, the timing, yes. But I don't think it was a player that they just plucked from somewhere and thought, he plays in the position that we need someone for. Let's try. That name was around at the end of June, wasn't it, when there was the Anderson and Odysseus transfers in different directions between Newcastle and Nottingham Forest. Before Newcastle played Bournemouth, the day before, Southampton were at home to Forest, and I went to St Mary's to watch that, and I was really keen to have a look at Elanga, not just because of the transfer links, but also Newcastle were going to Forest in a few days' time in the League Cup. He started really well, really well. He was lively, he was bright, he was, for 20, 25 minutes, the one that was looking as though he was going to make things happen. Then he was quiet. He went on one brilliant run in the second half and took a shot which was straight at the goalkeeper, and he'll have been disappointed with the finish. There's a lot there that I think you can see why Newcastle would like, and we remember as well the impact that he had. And he wasn't the only Forest player on Boxing Day when they won 3-1 at St James's. I mean, Morgan Gibbs-White that day ran the show, but Elanga was their outball and was devastating. And I think it was the first goal that he laid on a plate for Chris Wood. So it's the right sort of profile for Newcastle. I would have been, if they hadn't signed a defender, which of course they didn't. Lloyd Kelly accepted free transfer at the beginning of July from Bournemouth, having seen his contract there come to an end. I would have been fine. But for me, it was that position on the right-hand side. Newcastle are an attacking team, and I just feel like maybe another option in an attacking area could really see them take another step forward.
Now, viewers and listeners of the podcast know I'm a huge fan of Elanga. He really excites me. I think he's going to be a top player. He's got a little bit to go to get there, but like you said, you watch him and you can just tell he's got something really special about him. So had he signed, I would have been over the moon. If it was £50 million that they offered to him, I don't necessarily think in the long term that's an overpay. Of course, you can stretch the payments out over the years, but also I think he'll be worth that without a shadow of a doubt, if not more, in a couple of years' time when he does reach the levels that I fully expect him to. And like you say, we know Newcastle have watched him and do like him, and probably will go back in January as well. But it is interesting that the reaction to that link, even before any money was mentioned, it's not one that's overwhelmingly welcomed. When you talk about improvements on the right wing, the two names that came up the most, and I'm going to mention another name that some people have asked me to stop saying, but it's Brian Mbeumo and Anthony Elanga. They were the two that were often mentioned, and we know Newcastle have watched both, they like both. But you had a lot of fans saying that they are not necessarily an upgrade on what we've got, and if they are, it's not to the level which is going to get you top 4 football, which I totally disagree with.
Well, considering they were in for Michael Olise at the beginning of the summer, but he went to Bayern Munich. Respectfully, he is at a higher point right now than those two. But Elanga and Burmo have delivered in the Premier League. They're just slightly different players, aren't they, in terms of their overall skill set? But actually, they play in the same position. They can drift in from the right-hand side, and you know, they will set up goals. And certainly in the case of Burmo at Brentford, will score goals. And he could well be their main man this season. He would have been for a lot of it last year, in the absence of Ivan Toney. He's a very good player, but I do take the point. And Burmo, I think, was disappointing against Newcastle on the final day of last season, because I'd asked John Anderson, the former Newcastle player who's our co-commentator on BBC Radio Newcastle. I think even we said it during the match. You know, Newcastle being linked to Burmo. Watch him, let me know what you think. And he didn't have one of his better games, but when you look at the numbers, you can't really argue with that, because he does deliver.
He started the season very well as well. Now, Elanga has been speaking to a website in Sweden about Newcastle United's interest. And
have you translated it?
Someone else has. So
okay.
I'm gonna take that, my colleagues who have written the story up and put it on our website. They've got the translation right. Of course, a teammate on the international platform with Alexander Isak, supplying the crosses for him as well. He said, the environment in Nottingham is good. It is clear that you can see that Newcastle are interested. It means that I am playing good football when a big club shows interest. But Nottingham is also a big club. They've won 2 Champions Leagues, even though it was before I was born. But I'm happy in Nottingham, have a contract there. I'm focusing on Nottingham, hope to have a good season. Then we'll see what happens. He says also, Isak talked to me about it. That's Newcastle. But I said the same to him as I said to you. We have a good relationship and good chemistry when we play together. But I have a contract with Nottingham. Now, people I spoke to said, you know, he would have jumped at the chance to come to Newcastle United, but he, at the same time, a bit like Mark Gee, he's not going to be banging on the door to say I want to go. It's if the deal falls on the table, then give me something to think about. But that relationship with Isak could be crucial. You know, let's hope Newcastle keep Isak, and then you know that could be open the door for Elanga.
Well, it sounds like they've got him on the case, doesn't it? I'm sure Emil Kraft will be. Won't be too far away from that either, although he withdrew from the Sweden squad, didn't he, with a minor injury. We don't have any more news on that, do we? But hopefully it won't be too serious. I think he's played well when he's filled in this season. Yeah, maybe the door's not closed there, but look, they've got time now to take stock, haven't they? And Newcastle have added to their recruitment team behind the scenes, scouting department, the recruitment side generally. Since the takeover, you know, every department at Newcastle United has grown. Which it needed to do just to bring them in line with mid-ranking Premier League clubs, never mind the big boys who'd been in the top positions when Newcastle had their struggles in the Mike Ashley era. So they've got plenty of people working and looking, and maybe other names, other options will come up. But again, the point that I made a few times now, I mean, I think it was in January, Eddie Howe talked about needing to be creative in the transfer market. And I don't know if Newcastle are creative in the transfer market enough. And it's that Brighton point again. Now, there are players that Brighton sign that sometimes don't play much for them, and then they move on. And Newcastle probably did that with Yankuba Minte, coincidentally going to Brighton. That's an example of how doing something different can work financially. I would have liked to have seen Minte play for Newcastle, as I'm sure we all would. But I'd probably like to see, you know, just a little bit more of that, maybe take a chance on a couple of young players. And you could argue William Asula is one of those. And I limited what we've seen of him, but I really liked it. He scored a good goal, didn't he, for the Danish under-21s last week. So yeah, you've got the names that are out there that we know that they've been interested in. It would be good to see them maybe just surprise us a little bit and maybe do some of those other deals. As well as signing players for now, maybe get some more players in for the future, do more deals like Minte, more deals like Brighton do, loan them out, and then maybe they'll reap the rewards in the years to come.
But it's interesting. I mean, that also comes down to the manager wanting to play youngsters, and anyhow doesn't tend to want to do that unless he's forced to, whereas we saw with the injury crisis last summer. But the Brighton thing's really interesting because I get what you're saying, you know, in terms of buying young and maybe send them out on loan to get that experience, brilliant. But the overarching approach from Brighton, it's brilliant to a certain extent, but are they ever going to challenge for the title? I know they've started the season really well, but in a couple of years' time, they're going to sell 1-2 of them players who've hit the ground running this season, and you're just constantly on that loop of selling your best players to then reinvest. I think if you offered that to Newcastle United fans, they said we don't want that.
Yeah.
We want to be in a position where we're buying talented players, okay, from abroad, from England, wherever, but maybe we sell one and we reinvest, but we reinvest bigger and better, but we are challenging for the title. And I can never see Brighton doing that.
No, although it did take them from relegation fight up to they finished 6th, didn't they? When Newcastle finished 4th, it dropped off a bit last season, but again, like Newcastle, I think it was the effects of Europe, and Newcastle are a better team than Brighton last season. I mean, that's what the league table showed, although they got battered down there at the start of the season. Maybe they can just do some of what they're doing, learn from them, or do it on a bigger scale, perhaps. But it's more those younger players that can be around the squad that can come in and have an impact. Because I don't think you make the point about younger players. Lewis Miley, phenomenal. Elliot Anderson, I really rate highly. Had it not been for injuries, he would have been established in my view. There aren't many beyond that who are ready at the moment for the first team. And there are other clubs who go and sign those young players, and they might loan them out and bring them back, and then they get integrated. And I just think that's the sort of thing that they could probably do more of. And that's touching on what Paul Mitchell said about the prices of established players in England. And there is more value in European markets. In Newcastle, they've got a scouting department, they've got a recruitment department, and they're doing all this work to try and identify targets. And yeah, look, I say it would be nice if they could do some of those deals. That would be my view and my analysis of it.
Yeah, let us know in the comments. Do you think Newcastle United need to be a bit more Brighton, perhaps? Would you like Newcastle to sign Anthony Elanga as well? I'm interested to know what you think. We've got Craig asking here, Reza, has the international break come around at a good time for once? Tonali, Gordon, Isaac, Bruno all looking fitter for playing for their countries and building confidence. And we've titled this as the £40 million man will be back. I really do think Anthony Gordon getting to play for England and enjoying it, he's playing with a smile. The summer was heartbreaking for the lad to go to the Euros, watch England limp to the final, and you're not getting a chance to impact it after your best season of club football. He's now getting the chance. He looks happy. I think we're going to see the Gordon that we saw last season. What was it, 11 goals? I think he scored. I think now he's starting to get that chance on an international level. We'll see him back against Wolves, against Fulham, against City, smile on the face and hitting the back of the net as well.
Anthony Gordon's probably my favourite player in the Newcastle team because of, just how devastating he is when he's in full flight. Isak too, but there's something about Gordon because opinion was split when he signed, and I thought he did a lot better than other people seem to think in those first few months. But then last season, goodness me, the way that he elevated his game to the levels he reached was incredible. And there were times he was Newcastle's most important player because others were unavailable. How he wasn't nominated for the Premier League's Young Player of the Year award, I still don't understand. And then to be overlooked at the Euros I was mystified by it, and clearly he was as well. And it's been actually good to see him address that in interviews this week around the match against Ireland. Lee Carsley put him straight in. He knows what he can do, and wow, we saw that on Saturday, didn't we? So I hope that he feels good in himself and valued by England, and that can only benefit Newcastle United as he gets fitter, because a lot of players, as Eddie Howe's acknowledged, they haven't looked like they're at peak fitness, and that's some of those that came back a bit later in the summer, and just it is the start of the season. So if these players get fitter, they're only going to get better. And I'm a huge fan of Gordon. The point on the international break, I think, even though they're unbeaten, yes, it has come at a good time, and it's for that reason, to get players fitter and get them playing themselves into form. And the next 3 matches, the cup tie and Wolves away, Fulham away in the Premier League, I think they're pretty good fixtures to come back to before Manchester City.
And you got Tonali as well. Lovely assist in his last game. Play Israel tonight, so you may feature in that. The last game was against France. If you haven't seen the assist, you've been living in a rock. Fantastic little heel flick back over to his teammates. So great to see him back on the international scene. We've mentioned Isaac there. But also the good thing about this international break is that he's got quite a few of his first team on Tyneside, and they were in training last week. Joe Linton, Longstaff, Trippier, so he can work with these. I mean, I know Livramento has been starting at right back, but some influential players that he can work with. He hasn't had Trippier during an international break for since he's been here, has he? So having the chance to work with the majority of your first team will be hugely beneficial. Obviously, he's without Tonali, without Gordon, without Livramento, without Isaac, but he's going to have a chance to really drill them down.
Yeah, Harvey Barnes is there as well. Not yet back in an England squad. I don't know what his international future is because Scotland have been interested as well. But look, this time on the training pitch is where Newcastle will put things in place so that they can make this a successful season. And I really think that it can be, despite all we've talked about, the frustrations of the transfer window. I think probably we're all sick of talking about it and sick of hearing about it, even though there's a lot more that to be said. What for me, the most important thing over the last couple of weeks, given the transfer frustrations, given the changes at the club behind the scenes over the summer and supporter reaction to that, is that even though the performances weren't at the level that we know Newcastle can be at, and there's plenty of analysis of those performances and reasons why they weren't brilliant. They've got 7 points out of 9 in the Premier League. It's their best start since 2011 when they finished 5th in terms of a 3-game period at the start of the season. And they threw in the cup. They almost went out. So it's so important that with concerns and frustrations at things behind the scenes and at transfers, that the team has delivered results. Because Newcastle United, we've been there so many times when there's been fan unrest and frustration, things not happening in the way that people want them to off the pitch, and the team hasn't been getting results, and it's an awful mix. So that win over, the Bournemouth disallowed goal, critical. I think we'll look back on that at the end of the season as being a major moment. And then to win that game against Spurs, where they had moments in the first half before the assistant referee got injured, and that seemed to turn things in Spurs' favour. And then I think they were mostly all right in the last 15 minutes after the goal. But the middle bit, blimey, that was pretty rough, and yet they won. So they deserve massive credit for that, and thank goodness they did, because I dread to think what the mood would have been. But I'm really looking forward to Wolves on Sunday, and then Fulham as well, because they've got a great record at Fulham. Not so much at Molineux. Tends to end
a draw, doesn't it?
1-1, doesn't it? They're not always thrillers, but it's a good fixture for them, I think, and it'll give us a better sense of where they are, because they'll be a month into the season at that point. Had the international break, they've got results behind them. Can they build on it and move away from the frustrations and make it a successful few months?
Yeah, I think that'll be the aim, won't it? And it'll be Eddie Howe trying to put in that kind of feeling where it's us against the world within the dressing room. He's done it before, that siege mentality kind of approach to things. And you never know, by the time Man City come around, it could be a battle of the top two at the top of the table. Fingers crossed if they beat Wolves and Fulham and get through the cup as well. Come on, let's finish with a bit of positivity and optimism. Reza, thank you for popping on to the podcast. Are they going to beat Wolves?
Yes. I do you know what? I think they're going to win the next 3. They'll win at Fulham again. They'll beat Wolves. They'll beat Wimbledon in the cup as well. Can I just very quick mention for Gateshead, managed by Rob Elliott, once of Newcastle, took over from Mike Williamson last season. They're top of the National League. They've been top for a week now. I watched their game against Eastleigh. Gateshead were second, Eastleigh were top. Gateshead won 2-1 with 10 men, went top. They were phenomenal. and then they beat Barnet, who've been in the Football League, fancied to win the National League this season. I think they might be the title favourites, or they were in the summer. Gateshead beat them 2-0 at the weekend. Their captain is out injured with a broken leg after a horror challenge. Their goalkeeper's on international duty with the Irish under-21s. They've got a defender who would start, who's got a broken leg as well. They've got problems, but they've been absolutely phenomenal. And I know there's lots of support for the North East non-league scene from Newcastle fans and in the wider, football public here. But they're doing so well. The football they play is beautiful, and it's translating into results. They won at Wembley in May. They had a problem in the playoffs. They couldn't enter because of issues with the stadium, which I think will be sorted, so they could go up. Hopefully that'll be the case. But they've had a great start to the season, playing brilliant football at top of the National League. And I just wanted to give them a mention. There's a lot of links, obviously, black and white links, but with Rob Elliott in charge, and Louis Story, who's the assistant manager, was previously at Newcastle as well. Plenty of connections between Newcastle and Gateshead, who are absolutely flying.
Yeah, well, fingers crossed that continues. It has been a fantastic start of the season for both Newcastle and Gateshead. Thank you again to Matthew for popping on to the podcast. You guys watching, give the video a thumbs up, give it a share. If you listen on our audio platform, thank you as always. Do leave us a rating and review. And for myself, I'll see you guys very soon.